Welcome to these sessions. In this session, we will be discussing Samkhya theory of epistemology. In Samkhya epistemology, we will be discussing that what are the valid knowledges, what are the sources of valid knowledges Samkhya system believes, and also accepts that these are the sources are valid sources of knowledge, or these are the sources through which any knowledge we obtain are known as valid knowledge. As you know, epistemology deals with theory of knowledge, and we get knowledge from various sources like perception. We see some object, therefore we also know what its object is. Perception are of two types, as you know. One is ordinary perception, another is extraordinary perception. In case of ordinary perception, that we see even at distant places, even in near places, and we also know many of these objects through our 5 sense organs, that is called ordinary perception. But in case of extraordinary perception, in that case knowledge will be accumulated or gained only through mind or mental activity. Henceforth, it is said that there are two types of perception, and these two types of perception accepted by Samkhya philosophy. They also accepted inferential knowledge. What is an inferential knowledge? As you know that there are two types of inference, one is deductive inference, another is inductive inference. In case of deductive inference, we will go from general to particular. For example, all men are mortal, Rama is a man, therefore Rama is mortal. So when you say that all men are mortal is a major premise, when you say that Rama is a man is a minor premise, when we conclude that therefore Rama is mortal is a conclusion. So this sort of inference, the conclusion is derived from the premises taken together. In this case also, the knowledge that we generate or gain, it is inferential knowledge, and this is accepted by Samkhya theory. They say that inferential knowledge will be a valid knowledge. The another inference is known as inductive inference. In case of inductive inference, we proceed from particular to general. For example, if you see that crow X is black in a particular situation and condition, if you see another crow, say let us say crow Y is black in another context, another geographical situation, and if you see that crow Y is black and crow Z is black, so on and so forth, at the last you can conclude that all crows are black because of the few experiences that you have seen and gained through. So this kind of knowledge also accepted by Samkhya theory. Now the third type that they accepted is known as verbal testimony. What is a verbal testimony? Verbal testimony, somebody is an expert, somebody is aware of some facts, and that person is a trustworthy person, and whatever he or she speaks on a particular issue or event or a fact or a state of affairs, that we will accept. His or her utterances on that issue will be known as a testimony. It is a testimony for us, for the hearer who has to believe on his or her utterances. This is known as verbal testimony. In some sense, many philosophers claim that in Vedas, whatever things are written, all are testimony, and these are the verbal testimony, because it is said by the Rishis. So in this class, we will be discussing how Samkhya really proves that these three sources of valid knowledge, that perception, inference and comparison, these three sources of valid knowledge will be considered as the only sources of valid knowledge, and other sources of valid knowledge will not be considered as a valid knowledge. For example, Anupalabdhi, Arthapati, Upamana, all these sources are not be considered as a valid knowledge. So now the curiosity might becomes in your mind that what is the real issue for Samkhya. As a result, Samkhya system considers only these 3 sources, but not in other sources of Vedic knowledge, which is accepted by other schools apart from Samkhya. Now in my slide I will be discussing that Samkhya as a system recognizes 3 sources, so perception, inference and verbal testimony. On their view, self possesses knowledge. Now as you know that Samkhya believes there are 2 kinds of eternal realities, one is Purusha, another is Prakriti. Prakriti is material, Purusha is pure consciousness and inactive, whereas Prakriti is inactive. This Purusha and Prakriti being the eternal realities, ubiquitous and all pervading, their mere closeness with each other resulted the different objects that we find in this earth. There are many objects that we find in this earth having different color, different shape. We also find some animate objects which have life. Being the Purusha being the self consciousness or pure consciousness, some persons of consciousness find in case of self. Therefore, this self is known as individual or animate objects in this earth, but their body as such, it is produced from Prakriti, because Prakriti is a material object. And how we gain the knowledge? Here Samkhya argues that an individual perceives some object or sees some object or have a contact with some object through the sense organs. As you know that there are 5 sense organs: nose, eyes, ear, tongue and skin. Through these 5 sense organs, if any object will be contacted, then sense organs accumulated some information or gather some sense data. Again that sense data has to be sent to the mind. In the mind there is a mental process, mental activity. The mind will be analyze and synthesize the data sent by the sense organs, and while analyzing and synthesizing, it try to find out the real nature of the object by the help of Mod. Now mind helps to recognize or cognize that object as it is. There are many cases, as you know that we mistakenly cognize a rope as a snake, a shell as a silver, but in true case this is not so. In the later period, when mind analyzes the attributes of that particular object, find that it is not silver, it is a shell, it is not a snake, rather it is a rope. So therefore we gain knowledge in these the three steps. The first step is that through our sense organs the object is get contacted, and while get contacted the sense organs accumulated some information about that object, whether that object is a solid or liquid or it does not have any other attributes. This information sent to the mind, and mind accumulates, analyze, synthesize this information sent by the sense organs, and the later it find out the true nature of the object through Mod, because as you know that Mod is the first product of that evolution, and this is the way we gain knowledge. Once we gain knowledge, then we say that it is mine, or this is me, or I have understood this. This I, mine and all this, these are ego. Ego and ahankara is another product of evolution. Since you have an ego, we have a life, self. Since we are individual and self having ego, we identify an object in a particular object as it is and claim that this is or that is mine, and henceforth we gain some kind of knowledge on that object. When you say that I understood this object, that means you have a knowledge or understanding of that some object. So these are the way the individual receives a knowledge. Now further they said that Mod is being unconscious and physical element cannot generate knowledge alone. like the Prakriti being a material cause cannot produce the different objects until unless there is a Purusha involved in it, or there is a conscious object involved in it. In this regard they said that Moth being the first product is an active and unconscious, cannot create the objects in this earth, cannot create specifically the jiva or the animate objects which is a life in this earth. Hence it requires a conscious or eternal entity known as Purusha. Since Purusha is pure consciousness, it helps Prakriti to generate knowledge. The knowledge that we generate, the knowledge through which we claim that this object is different from that object, or this object has a different attributes which is not found in other objects, it is just because of the Purusha, the part of the Purusha find in a jiva, so that the jiva thinks that he or she himself is a Purusha, as a result accumulates knowledge, and this is the ego through which we think that we are the human being and we are different from the animals. And when you say that you are a human being, you accumulate particular knowledge and particular wisdom for a particular issue event, then you say that you already received the knowledge of that object. This is the way we understand certain object, we identify certain object, and also we are able to differentiate why X object is different from Y object. Now we will see that when they say that perception is a valid source of knowledge, what are the things in their mind, how they claim that perception is a valid sources of knowledge. Like Nyaya philosophy, Samkhya philosophy accepts there are two kinds of perception, one is Savikalpaka, another is Nirvikalpaka. Savikalpaka is a determinate perception, whereas Nirvikalpaka is an indeterminate perception. Now let us give an example. What is Savikalpaka? When you identify an object, let us say I identify a water bottle having some of the particular features, and truly that object has these are the features, that is called Savikalpaka. It means if an individual or a jiva can able to identify an object as it is, that is a Savikalpaka perception. Suppose I see a table, I touch it and I feel the hardness and also the surface of the table, then it is a Savikalpaka. What is a Nirvikalpaka perception then? Nirvikalpaka perception is an indirect perception which is not valid always or which is not true always. For example, suppose you come from your home to your college or a hostel or a place, you move from a particular place to a other place. When you reach a destination, if somebody will ask that while coming on the road, have you seen X and Y object? Not necessarily you have marked it that object, however there may be chances that you might have, your eyes might have crossed on that, you might have perceived that. Since you are not interested on that object, you may not be able to recognize that object. However, you try to recapitulate through your mental process whether you have came across that particular object which is asked to you. There are many situations you can say that I think so that I might have crossed that object, but I could not able to recapitulate exactly where that object lies. This is because of Nirvikalpa Pratyakya, indeterminate perception. You have perceived but not able to identify exactly. That means you are not purely conscious about it. The mind has not received the knowledge of that object in a true form. Henceforth, the knowledge that you gain by seeing even that, it is not a true knowledge, it is not a valid knowledge, that is called indeterminate perception. You have perceived but not in a determinate way, therefore it is an indeterminate perception. These two kinds of perception, one is Savikalpaka and another is Nirvikalpaka. These two kinds of perception is also accepted by Nyaya philosophy, which is a realistic. Nyaya philosophers are realist in nature. This is exactly accepted in the same form by the Samkhya philosophy. Now similar to Naya, they also said that to have an inference we need a Vyapti relation. Further Samkhya said that age Naya accept that to have an inference we need a Vyapti relation. Samkhya accept the inference relation in the same fashion, same manner, same way. Samkhya says that to have an inference we need at least 5 premises or 5 propositions, because Naya prescribes that. They also said that there should be a Vyapti relation find between the terms that you find in the propositions. As you know that to have an inference we need 3 terms minimum. These are major term, minor term and middle term. Major term find in the major premise, minor term find in the minor premise, and in the conclusion you never find the middle term, you only find major term and minor term. The middle term you find both in major premise and minor premise. It helps, the middle term helps the major premise and minor premise to connect with each other. As a result you are able to establish in the conclusion major term and minor term. Therefore again I repeat, in a syllogism or inference you find 3 propositions minimum, but whereas Naya prescribes 5, that we will be going to discuss in the next slide. But at present for your understanding you must know that to have an inference we need 3 propositions. The first 2 propositions are known as major premise and minor premise, and the last one will be a conclusion. The conclusion will be drawn from the 2 premises, major premise, minor premise taken together. In the major premise you find major term and middle term, in the minor premise you find minor term and middle term, and in the conclusion you find there is a major term and minor term. The middle term makes a link between a major term and minor term. This is the structure of the inferences. They said that any inference that you construct there should be a Vyapti relation. What is a Vyapti relation? Vyapti relation means there is a universal invariable concomitance relation that you find between major term and middle term. That Hetu and Sadhya, according to Naya philosophy, the middle term is known as Hetu and major term is known as Sadhya. What they said is that any inference having Vyapti relation means the major term and middle term must have an invariable, universal and concomitant relation. Then only the inference will be considered as a valid one, and henceforth any knowledge that we gain from that inferences is a valid knowledge. Now they said that like Naya philosophy we are having 2 kinds of inferences. There are certain inferences that we draw or we construct by the help of universal affirmative propositions. For example, if I say all men are mortal, all politicians are men, therefore all politicians are mortal. When I say that all men are mortal, you find that here men is the middle term and mortal is the major term. In the second premise, when I say that all politicians are men, here politicians is the minor term and men is the middle term. Here the middle term men is connecting major premise with the minor premise. As a result, in the conclusion we say that therefore all politicians are mortal. Here politicians are the minor term and mortal is the major term. So this is all you find in each proposition, major premise, minor premise and conclusion you find all. When you say all, this is the universal affirmative. That means the predicate affirms the subject completely or wholly. This is a kind of inferences, and through which any knowledge that we gain, this is also accepted by Samkhya philosophy. There are another forms of constructing the inference that is called through universal negative proposition. For example, if I say what is a universal negative proposition, in symbolical form it is represented as E. E stands for no. No means if you say that no men are mortal, it is an universal negative proposition. That means the predicate completely denies the subject. This is the universal negative proposition. If I say no crows are black, say no cuckoos are black, therefore no cuckoos are crows. Here in all the cases you find the propositions start with no, and you find that in each proposition the predicate completely negates the subject. In symbolic logic you find universal affirmative proposition stands as A and represent all, universal negative proposition stands E and represents no. According to Samkhya philosophy, there are two types of inferences that we construct and through which that any knowledge we gain or generate or any knowledge that we accumulate is known as a valid knowledge. So there are two types of inferences that I have discussed. Though you find that in one hand there is a universal affirmative proposition as an inference, in another hand you find that universal negative propositions. However, you find that there is a Vyapti relation in both the cases. Without Vyapti relation we cannot make an inferences. So the basic ingredient to have an inferential knowledge is a Vyapti relation, which means or which explains the Vyapti relation explains as the middle term and the major term must have an universal, invariable and concomitant relation. If this is there in a syllogism or inference, we consider as a valid one, and henceforth any knowledge that we gain from this inferential knowledge is known as valid knowledge. Thus categorically the same way said by Nyayikas. Nyayikas also said that sometimes these three propositions is not a valid way of drawing the conclusion, or in other words they said that when you say that there are three propositions required for an inference, it is not true in all the cases. For Nyayikas we need 5 types of propositions or 5 propositions to draw the conclusion, and this is exactly accepted the same way by Nyayikas. Whatever Nyayikas said that we need a 5 proposition to establish a inferential knowledge, Samkhya also agrees to that. Therefore, according to Samkhya we need at least 5 propositions to draw a conclusion. To must have an inferential knowledge means we must have 5 propositions. Now let us discuss what are the 5 propositions. Now if you see in this slide, the first sentence, the hill is fiery. The second sentence, because it is smoky. The third sentence, whatever is smoky is fiery. The fourth sentence says the hill is smoky, and the fifth sentence says the hill is fiery. In true sense, if you deduct either first 2 premises or the last 2 premises, you can draw the conclusion and there will be no error in your conclusion. The conclusion will be a valid one. However, Samkhya and Nyaya together say that we need these are the 5 propositions. Now let us assume you removed the first 1 and 2 propositions and you kept these 3, 4, 5 as a propositions. Now I said that there is a Vyapti relation you find between the major term and minor term. Now you find that let us say 3 is the major premise and 4th is the minor premise and 5th is the conclusion. How we will be doing that? Wherever there is smoke there is fire, whatever there is smoky is fiery. That means so far your experience says that suppose you see a candle and you burn it, you say that there is a fire and there is a smoke. Suppose you see in your kitchen that there is a smoke, that means there is a fire on it, and there are many instances that you find that fire and smokes are always associated with each other. The second premise I made that the hill is smoky. In a distant place you are seeing that there is a smoke finding on a hill. That means in both the premises smoke is a middle term because they are finding in both the premises. However, you find that hill is a different term and fire is a different term. Since fire is found in the major premise, it is the major term and heel is the minor term, and the conclusion therefore you say that the heel is fiery. That means establishing sadhya in pakhya. Sadhya means major term, sadhya stands for major term, pakhya stands for minor term, and hetu stands for middle term. Here fire is a major term, smoke is a middle term, and heel is a minor term. Now you can see that what is the necessity of 5 propositions according to Samkhya and Nyaya philosophy. They said that first you see the heel is fiery. First you see that you come to conclusion that the heel is fiery because you find there is a smoke inside it, or you can see the smoke from a distant place. Now you can recapitulate through your mind saying that wherever you have seen smoke there is a fire. It is your experiencing, it is an empirical experience through which you accumulated knowledge that wherever there is a smoke there is a fire, and since you are able to see there is a smoke on the heel, and therefore the conclusion you can draw that the heel is fiery. Either the first proposition the heel is fiery and the 5th proposition the heel is fiery, both are the established conclusion based on the proposition that you are having in your hand. For example, if you remove that 4 and 5 at present, now you are having 3 propositions in your hand, that is the heel is fiery because it is smoky, and you know that wherever there is smoke there is fire. Now the heel is fiery, the conclusion, because it is a smoky is a minor premise, and the major premise will be wherever there is smoke there is fire. Now how you will do it? Now immediately after seeing the smoke on a heel, you conclude that the heel is fiery because you see the smoke and fire together in all the cases whatever your experience is. In short, I say that though there are 3 propositions, minimum 3 propositions required to have an inference, but Samkhya and Nyaya together claim that we need 5 propositions to have an inferences. 3 propositions sometimes is not sufficient enough to provide an inferential knowledge which will be a valid knowledge. In short, they said that hetu should be found in pakhya, hetu should be associated with sadhya always, and therefore you establish sadhya in pakhya. So this is the way you understand inferences, and henceforth you get the knowledge, inferential knowledge. Now I hope that you understand that what Samkhya mean by inferential knowledge. So if this is the case, find in any kind of inferences, the knowledge that you accumulate, the knowledge you gain is known as a valid knowledge. That knowledge will be considered or treated or judged as the valid knowledge. So in this way Samkhya philosophy claim that perception is a valid source of knowledge, or perception is a pramana. Also said that inference or anumana, anumana is a Sanskrit term of inference, said that inference or anumana is also a valid pramana, is a valid knowledge, is a pramana. Now we will see the third pramana which Samkhya philosophy prescribe is known as verbal testimony or sabda. Now how sabda can be considered as a valid knowledge? Because there are every chances that you hear a sound but it is a mistake, and that sound never comes in that side, some other side. Sometimes it may be in your dream that you hear a sound but this is not true. Now this is, now you may be curious to knowing that how Samkhya establishes that verbal testimony or sabda is a valid knowledge, or the sources of valid knowledge is a pramana. Now continuing on the account of Samkhya philosophy, I said that there are 2 kinds of sabda that they accept, 2 kinds of valid knowledge, valid testimony they accept. One is Laukika, another is Vaidika. Now what is Laukika? Laukika means it is an ordinary sabda. That means suppose you hear a sound any places through your sense organs, that is the ordinary sounds. For example, somebody knock at your door, you hear a sound. If you drop a stone the soil also you get some sounds. If you speak something, there is a different sound, and here the ear, your sense organ ear make a differentiate from these other sounds. Also said that the sound heard from a distant places, though you have not seen that, still it is a knowledge. It means something or other there is a contact between your sense organs. Any of the sense organs contacts with any of this noise or voice is known as sounds. What is sound truly means? Any kind of vibration in the air is known as sound. That is a Laukika. For example, you want to cross a river. Now you ask somebody who is standing in a bank of the river saying that, can you help me to find out whether I could able to cross the river by walk, how much water there in that river, is it a deep river, that kind of knowledge. And that person, whatever he or she said, you believe on that person, and his or her utterance is a testimonial for you. The knowledge that you generate from this, it is known as Laukika. But however, the mystery lies here. For example, now you want to cross a river, you find there are three types of men. The first one is a fisherman who is catching the fish. The second one, there is a person who is riding a horse. The third man who is wearing jeans, shirts, bags, and also ready to cross that river. Now immediately among the three, you will ask the fisherman about the water in this river. The reason behind that, you know that the fisherman may be much acquainted with the depth and width of this river rather than other these two persons. And how you do that? This is because of your reason. And though you do not know the person of the fisherman, still whatever he or she says about this, about the river, the water of the river, you accept, and you consider that this knowledge is a valid knowledge. And this kind of knowledge is called Sabda or verbal testimony. In this regard, many systems, Indian philosophy said that Vedas also a valid testimony, because there are many knowledge that we gain from Veda. Veda is written by somebody and also spoke by somebody, because it is a Rishi or saint. Therefore, they said that there are two kinds of knowledge we generate from verbal testimony. One is Laukika, another is Vaidika. Verbal testimony are of two types. One is Laukika, that is ordinary person, ordinary sabda, ordinary sounds or ordinary utterances, and another is Vaidika, that means the Veda or Upanishad or whatever they said, the knowledge that we generate is known as verbal testimony. So there are two types of verbal testimony through which we accumulate knowledge or gain knowledge, and that knowledge will be valid, which is prescribed or accepted, suggested by the Samkhya epistemology. So this is all about the verbal testimony. Further they said that though the Bhagavad Gita are considered as the verbal testimony, but these are not eternal. Why these are not eternal? The Bhagavad Gita, whatever it says, it is a human being who understand it and accumulate the knowledge. The human being never lives in this earth permanently. Once they die, the knowledge also disappears. Henceforth, Bhagavad Gita is not an eternal one. The knowledge that we gain from Bhagavad Gita is not an eternal one, though the scripture may be eternal. But however, Samkhya philosophy said that there are two eternal realities. One is Purusha and Prakriti. Apart from that, nothing is eternal. Not even the knowledge that we generate from this Bhagavad Gita is a valid, through valid testimony, is not an eternal. They also said that while there is a perception, there are two kinds of ordinary and extraordinary. When you have a feeling, when you have a hunger, this is internal. When you have a hunger, that is cannot be shown, it has to be inferred. When you are angry with others, angry is not an object, therefore you cannot show, therefore it is internal. But the object like chalk piece, duster, table, chair, camera, etc. can be shown, can be perceived, or the sound can be heard from the chalk piece, from the bottle, from the duster, from your mobile, etc. That is an external one. But the internal shabda may be your hungriness, your angriness, your feeling, your desire. Therefore, they said that ordinary perception is of two types, one is external, another is internal. Internal always connected to the mind, feelings, wishes, desires, etc. Whereas external, the table, chair, all the things, we know this, we also have knowledge on these objects as a hard object because of our sense organs. Therefore, they said that there are three types of pramana, one is perception or pratyekya, inference or anumana, the third one is verbal testimony or shabda. They said that verbal testimony are of two types, Laukika and Vaidika. They also said that though the Bhagavad Gita or Vedas are considered as a testimonial knowledge or a valid knowledge, however, that knowledge cannot be regarded as an eternal knowledge. They did not regard Vedas as eternal because of this reason, because they said that Vedas are due to the human beings and human beings accumulates knowledge from the Vedas. However, once human being died, the knowledge never remain as it is, it perishes. Henceforth, the knowledge gained from the Vedas cannot be considered as an eternal one. Now you have learned that how Samkhya philosophy said about the epistemology, theory of knowledge. Now we are reaching to the last part where we will be describing Samkhya ideas or concept on bondage and liberation. See, every system try to establish that there is a dukkha in the present life of a human being. There is a suffering, there is a klesha. Klesha is a Sanskrit word, its translation is dukkha. There is a suffering, there is a pain in this earthly life, and every system try to prescribe something to eradicate these sufferings, to eradicate these pains, and try to get the pleasure. What is the real pleasure in the earthly life? How a person can be free from the suffering, free from the diseases, free from the cravings, desires, all this. As you know that Samkhya philosophy said that it is the mind, it is the self which is a part of Purusha. Getting the consciousness from the Purusha thinks that he is an individual, he or she is an individual having the ego, intellect, buddhi, through which get the ego-ness, it is mine, this is mine, that is mine. Therefore, it is because of this ego, ahankara, the self or the jiva or the individual suffers, try to get much more things in the present life, therefore suffering continues. And how to stop these sufferings? In this way, Samkhya philosophy also prescribes some concepts, also describe many of these issues that we will be going to discuss now. According to Samkhya philosophy, there are not only one Purusha, there are many Purusha, because it is because of the pure consciousness of Purusha we have the animate life in this earth in a different form, human beings, animals, reptiles, insects, etc. Since we are a living animals or living birds, living reptiles, we all have a soul. Therefore, they said that the self, which is getting a very little percent of consciousness from the true Purusha, the eternal Purusha, by thinking that he or she is an eternal, and also identifies because of his or her ignorance with the help of manas, ahankara and mahat, find that his existence is a true one. What I have said is that the self who is eternal, pure consciousness and all pervading, due to ignorance identify itself with the manas, ahankara and mahat, which are the products of prakriti. What happens? The self or jiva, even a single animate objects in this earth who has a life, gets a very little proportion of consciousness from the pure consciousness. And while Purusha and Prakriti comes close together, some part of Mahat also transformed to the object. That means our body is an object, whereas our life, our breath, our soul is a consciousness. It is a subtle element. And here Samkhya argue that we have a body that is from Prakriti, however we have a jiva or a atma or soul self or intellect, ahankara. These are the subtle elements which are different from the gross object like body, is because of Purusha, and this is the little bit of self consciousness we have or consciousness we have through which we think that we identify object, and henceforth we claim that this object is mine. And because of this mineness, I-ness, we attach to the different objects differently in different situations, and henceforth the getting pleasure from these objects, different objects in this earth, we try to get much more and more. Whenever we are attaching with a particular object, we try to get pleasure in a different form, much and much way, and henceforth we are craving to get much more things, we are desire for much more things, and because of this desire and attachment we are suffering in this life. So therefore if anyone is suffering, it is the self who suffers, because the body will perishes, the body will die. It is the self who suffers according to Samkhya philosophy. They also said that the universe is constituted of manifold objects. Since objects are embedded with gunas and selves, even the interrelated among them, suffering is unavoidable. They said that wherever there is a guna, there is a suffering, because guna means it is in a prakriti, it is a product. These three gunas, if one guna dominates these two guna, then there is a product. Sattva raja tama, if this one guna dominates others two guna in a different way, in a different proportion, then we find a different object, and some part of consciousness involved to that. Here he is saying that if there is a guna and if there is a self find in a particular object, that object has to be suffer. Suffering cannot be avoided from that jiva if that jiva has guna and consciousness, and certainly a jiva must have a guna and consciousness, otherwise the jiva cannot be created or produced, cannot be exist in this earthly life. Since any jiva and individual have its own gunas, as well as a little portion of consciousness which is borrowed from the pure consciousness from Purusha, therefore suffering is unavoidable. They said that even after death, if there is a existence of human body, if guna will be there in that body, then suffering still remain or still continue. So they claim that if there is a guna which is a part of a product, which is an element of a product, if there is a guna in that product and also have a little consciousness, then that jiva or a soul has to be suffered, because of the ego and mind, the mental activity and ahankara attached to the different objects in different way, henceforth suffering is unavoidable. However, they prescribe that there are three kinds of suffering that we find in this earthly life. These are adhatmika. Adhatmika, what they mean is that it is due to the mental and physical causes. That means when you are anger, particular object, particular human being, particular animal, you suffer because of your mental exercises. When you are feeling hungry, if somebody say even a simple thing you get angry, you feel that kind of suffering. When you not get food, your stomach will be empty, you feel hungerness, and that is the suffering. People ready to do each and everything just to fill up their stomach, the minimum food they should get it. Thus they said that hunger also is kind of suffering. When you are diseased, also you are get suffer, and these are just because of both mentally and physically. Therefore they said that there are many cases you find that mental suffering and physical suffering, and both are related with each other. Suppose you are bedridden in a hospital and doctor said that you will be cured within 2 days, though you will have a physical pain, still you have mental pleasure. So therefore suffering sometimes mentally, sometimes physically. However, many times it is both mentally as well as physically. Whenever there is you had an accident, it is a physical pain as well as mental pain. But when you are anger, It is also physical pain as well as mental pain. It is mental pain because of you think that where you will get a food. It is a physical pain because you have to do something to get a food. So therefore they said that adhatmika is a kind of suffering. They also said that adhi bhautika, it happened due to your natural causes. Since you are a human being, you have to suffer. Since you are a bird, since you are a reptile, since you are a creature, since you have a jiva of some consciousness as well as some kind of prakriti, some kind of gunas you have in it, therefore you are suffering. They said that adi bhautika, this is all about adi bhautika. The last one they said that adi daivika, it is due to extraordinary causes. Many people suffer by thinking that there is a ghost exists. If they will do some work, ghost will recognize, and ghost, because of ghost they suffer. And also some, they have a rasi. They said that there is a stars. This star is not now supporting in my life. So therefore they started to do some action or other actions, and the suffering involved while you do the actions. You cannot do the actions without the objects. When you do the actions, you have to do the actions with the objects, both animate as well as non-animate. Therefore I said that there are many sufferings that jiva finds in the earthly life because of ghosts as well as some kind of supernatural power. So these three kinds of suffering that you find described by Samkhya philosophy. While describing that, they also said that the root cause of suffering is not realizing the true nature of self. What they mean is that when they said true nature of self means once the jiva will be recognized, what is the true nature of self, how the little self get the very very minute proportionate of consciousness from the Purusha. If that kind of true knowledge the jiva will accumulate or gain, then he can make a difference between Prakriti and Purusha. And when he says that Purusha is like a sun, and also it's a very small light by the self, and therefore self cannot compare with the Purusha, and henceforth cannot have a ego and ahankara in the earthly life. Therefore some kind of suffering can be removed as well as eradicated. So therefore the true nature of understanding self is required in that case. Further they said that it is the jiva identifies with himself because of ego, and also identify different object by saying that this is mine or that is mine, and this is because of mineness it suffers. And they said that since there is suffering, there is also paths leads to liberation. Liberation for them can be attained by understanding the true nature of self. By understanding the true nature of self, you can discriminate from Purusha and Prakriti, from jiva and Purusha. So therefore a jiva will be detached from the ego and ahankara. It is the mind which says that please do not associate with ego, though ego is a product of evolution. However, the buddhi, which is a psychological component, a practical aspect of mind, saying that please do not associate with that object as it is yours, because nothing is yours. It is Purusha and Prakriti really involves to create different objects. Once your body dies, you are no more. However, they said that there are two paths to lead to liberation. Samkhya believes that while in this earthly life a jiva can also get some kind of liberation, even after death they can get some liberation. Now we will be discussing what are these two liberation Samkhya is talking about. Now they said that Jiban Mukti as well as Videha Mukti. Jiban Mukti, when you get the liberation, it is because you will free from the all karmas. That means you need not to do further karmas. And in case of Videha Mukti, it is after death only, when your body, both subtle and element, subtle and gross body will be dies, perishes, you get liberation. That means when a Jiban Mukti, that means in the earthly life, present earthly life, you are detached from the karma theory. You will be not associating with a different karma, henceforth you will be liberating from all sufferings. And also they prescribe a different kind of liberation, it is not a Videha Mukti. They said that in Videha Mukti after death, since you are detached from all kind of karma, you get liberation. For them, liberation is the samambana of life. they said that liberation is a state of happiness, it is free from pain and also suffering. However, when Vedanta claimed that liberation is a state of happiness, Samkhya did not accept that. They said that both pleasure and pain, since both are relative in their nature, it is inseparable from the jivas, and henceforth once somebody got liberation, this happiness never arises. This happiness will be very lower level, and the state of liberation is very higher than that. Therefore, they said that there is no happiness in the state of liberation, it is above pleasure and sufferings. According to them, the Samkhya theory of liberation is known as apavarga or sanambanam of life. Now, I hope that you have understood what is Samkhya epistemology and how they describe bondage, and also how to detach from that suffering. Therefore, we can get liberated both in present life as well as in future life, and how at last they say that liberation is much above than this happiness. Thank you.